We do serve an awesome and a mighty God, and everything is dependent on Him. And that is something that we definitely need to remember at all times. We look back at history of the Bible and look at some of the things that God did, and they are just amazing. God took one man and made a nation from him. He called Abraham. Abraham was living in the land that he had grown up in. I'm sure he was kind of a lot like some of us. You know, we live in a place, we grow up in a place, and that kind of gets to be home. But Abraham got told by God that he needed to go to a land that He would tell him. He didn't tell him where it was, didn't tell him how to get there. He said, you start walking, when you get there, I'll let you know. And Abraham had the faith to believe God and trust God. And God took that one man and He gave him a son when he was 100 years old, over 100 years old, which wasn't supposed to happen. And then his son had 12 sons, and his 12 sons turned their family into 70 people. Those 70 people went down into Egypt, and because there was a famine, and they stayed there for 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, they had become slaves. And the people in Egypt, especially the Pharaoh, didn't want to turn loose of this slave labor. But God came to the point, He said, look, it's time for my people to go. God had taken one man and He had turned them into a nation of 1 million plus. And He went and sent Moses. Pharaoh said, I'm not going to let you go. And God did miraculous things. Now, most of what He did was a result of possibly some kind of natural disaster, but we know that it wasn't just a natural disaster, because God had it most of the time only affect the Egyptians and not affect His people. And He destroyed, for the most part, the nation of Egypt. If you think about all of the things that happened to the nation of Egypt during that time, it was severely weakened, even to the point that the firstborn males of every family in Egypt died. And finally Pharaoh said, okay, you can go. And then after they left, he decided, no, I'm not going to let them go. So he takes his army and he begins to pursue them, and he follows them until they have their backs against the Red Sea. Pharaoh's on one side, Red Sea's on the other. They begin to believe they're going to die. God parts the Red Sea. They walk across on dry ground. Pharaoh and his army began to follow them across. And the walls of water collapse on the army, and the Egyptian army is wiped out. God takes His people. He marches them across a desert land and brings them to the place that He says, the land that I've promised you is right over there. And all you have to do is go in and take it. So they send 12 spies into the promised land. They come back and they say the people are too big, the cities are too fortified, they're too strong, we can't do this, as if they had done anything so far. That's the part about the story that always amazes me. They had no way they could say they had been the reason that anything had happened. God had destroyed the most powerful nation on earth at that time. He had taken out their army. When the Israelites had their back to the Red Sea, there's no way that they could have imagined that it was them that had anything to do with their being saved from the army. God parted a sea. He destroyed the strongest army known in the world at that time. He had done everything. He had provided water for 1 million plus people in a desert where there was no water. He had provided food for 1 million plus people in a desert where there was no food, and they griped the whole way. And then they come to this promised land, and God tells them, all you have to do is what I say, and you'll conquer this land. You'll possess cities you didn't build. You'll eat from vineyards that you didn't plant. There is a ready-made life there for you. And they said, we can't do that. As if they had done anything that they had done so far. And God said, all right. None of you who are above 20 years of age will see the land that I promised. And they wandered in the desert for 40 years. The oldest person to go into the promised land, other than Joshua and Caleb, was 59 years old, because they had to be 19 years old or younger. They couldn't, if they were 20, they weren't going to get to go in. So the oldest person that went into the promised land was 59 years. God had them wander in the desert for 40 years until all of the people who had refused to have faith in Him died off. And those who didn't have any say were the only ones who were allowed to go. They had wandered for 40 years in the desert, and it says their shoes didn't wear out. That's something that I have always had a big question mark about. Because if they were 19 years or younger when they were wearing those shoes, their feet grew. So if their shoes never wore out, I guess their shoes had to keep getting bigger. And it's not just a matter of some tough leather. It was a miraculous thing of God that they had shoes to wear. And they did, and they had traveled all that way, and now they have again come to the entrance to the promised land. And Moses spends chapters 8, 9, and 10 of the book of Deuteronomy describing this journey that these people had been on. And all the miraculous things that God has done in their lives. And in Deuteronomy chapter 11, he begins to talk to them about God's requirements for entering this land. He says in verse 1, you shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep His charge, His statutes, His rules, and His commandments always. Now, God is saying, you are now responsible for loving me of your own volition and trusting me of your own volition and keeping my rules. You see, that's a part of trusting God that sometimes we don't really completely wrap our minds around. Because the Bible says that we have to trust our salvation to what Christ did on the cross. We have to trust our lives to the power and the capabilities of God. But that also goes down to the point that when God says don't do this, we have to trust Him that that's the best thing for us. And each and every time we choose to disobey what we know God has told us we should do, we are showing a lack of trust in God and His abilities. Every sin we commit says, God, I don't trust you. Just the same as Adam and Eve in the garden said, God, I don't trust you. And thankfully, Jesus has died so that our sins are removed. But we have to make the choice to trust God. He is a loving God. And He wants us to love Him. But He says the way that we show we love Him is by keeping His commandments. He says you're not saved by good works, but you are saved for good works. You're saved by grace, not by good works, but you are saved for good works. And then he goes on in verse 2, and he says, and consider today, since I am not speaking to your children who have not known or seen, Consider the discipline of the Lord your God, His greatness, His mighty hand, and His outstretched arm, His signs and His deeds that He did in Egypt to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all his land, and what He did to the army of Egypt, to their horses, to their chariots, how He made the water of the Red Sea flow over them as they pursued after you, and how the Lord your God has destroyed them to this day, and what He did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place, and what He did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, sons of Reuben, how the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their whole households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them in the midst of all Israel. For your eyes have seen all the great work of the Lord that He did. Now, what He's doing right from the get-go is He's saying, when your parents rebelled against me, you were children. And I did not hold you responsible, but now you are responsible. Today, you are responsible for the words that I'm speaking. You are responsible for carrying out the actions that I'm describing. I'm not talking to your children. I'm talking to you. Just as I did not talk to your parents, to you when I spoke to your parents, when you were children, I'm not talking to your children. You are now the ones who are responsible. You wandered in the desert for 40 years and I took care of you. And it wasn't your fault that you were there. But now you're accountable. And you have seen. Remember the things that you have seen me do. Remember what I did to Egypt. Remember how I took care of you in the desert. Remember when those who rebelled against me, the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up. Remember the things that I have done, because you are the ones who are now accountable for obeying me. Because you have seen my power. Because you have seen the mighty things that I've done. Because you know what I'm capable of. Because you know what I expect. Because you know who I am. And you will therefore now be responsible for these things. And you can live long in this land. You can be prosperous in this land if you're obedient. My love for you is not conditional. My salvation is not conditional. But my blessing is conditional. And the same thing holds true today. God's love for you is not conditional. God's salvation is not conditional. You're saved by grace through faith and that's it. But God's blessing is conditional. Obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings curses. Period. That has been the message of God. He says, these are my conditions. If you will obey my commandments, and if you will listen to what I'm telling you, and if you will remember what you're supposed to do, if you will serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, you will have an abundance. The land that I'm going to give you will provide more for you than you will ever need. You will be blessed in abundance beyond what you can dream. Because my love is not conditional. And my salvation is not conditional. But my blessing is conditional. Deuteronomy 11. God continues to speak. It says, you shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong and go in and take possession of the land that you are going over to possess, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them and to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you are entering to take possession of it is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and irrigated it like a garden of vegetables. But the land that you're going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain from heaven, and the land that the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And if you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then he will give rain for the land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. And he will give grass in your fields for your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. Take care, lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving you. My blessing is conditional upon obedience. That is the message that God gave them. He said, you're not living in a land like you lived in Egypt anymore, where you can jump up and down 3 times and water comes out of the ground, because it is a delta. The Israelites people lived in the Nile Delta. There was never a lack of water to irrigate crops. But what God is saying is that you're not living in a land now. You're not going to go into a land now that's like the land that you came out of. You are going into a land now where if it doesn't rain, you don't eat. It is a land where the people who live there, if they want to live in abundance, if they want to have all that they need, they have to depend on me, because I have to send the rain at the right time in order for the crops to grow. It is a land where you will live, if you live in faith, if you trust me, you believe in me, you do what I say, you will have more than you need. But if you don't, you won't. My love for you is not conditional. My salvation is not conditional, but my blessing is conditional. We know that the message of God is very plain. And he said, do this, this will happen. Do this, this will happen. And that's exactly what happened. They went into the land. God blessed them abundantly. They took out armies that were far more militarily trained and capable than they were. They were a bunch of people that had done nothing but make bricks all their life. And some of them didn't even do that. You remember they were 19 years or younger. And they had wandered in the desert for 40 years, eating what God gave them, drinking what God gave them. They hadn't worked a day in their life other than to take down the tabernacle and put it back up and march across the desert whenever God told them to. They hadn't been trained in doing anything. They weren't a military power. They were just a bunch of people that wandered around in the desert for 40 years. They didn't have a military, but they had God. And they walked into this nation where we know from what the Bible says and from other things in history, some of these people were huge. 7, 8, 9 feet tall. And they had armies that were trained, and they had walls on their cities. The first thing that God did was take them to the city of Jericho that had walls so thick that they raced chariots on top of them. And they said, what are we going to do about this? And God said, march around the city once every day, shout, and go home. And they did that. And on the last day, he said, by the way, today blow trumpets, and the city walls are going to fall down. And they did. You would think that would be enough to say, hey, we need to do what God says in detail. But they took the land, and it was just like God said. It was a fertile land, still is. It was a place, one of the only places around that part of the world that has a constant water flow through the Jordan River. and the rains come, and the crops grow great there. I got to see some of that in November. In November, I got to see, I love dates. And everywhere I went, there were piles of dates. I ate so many dates this winter I wasn't sick. But these date trees are everywhere, just grove after grove after grove after grove of trees growing in the middle of a desert. And God said, look, go in, you obey me, it's going to continue to be this way. What did they do? They got self-sufficient. They started worshiping other gods. They started sacrificing their children to false gods instead of worshiping the God who had done all these things to bring them to this place. He went on to say in verses 18 through 32, you shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. He's saying, these words that I'm saying to you right now are to be the governing thing in your life. They are to be what is more important than anything else there is. There is to be nothing more important to you. You are to put these where they're always before you, where you can always see them. Bind them on your hands. Put them before your eyes. Do whatever you have to do not to forget, because if you forget and you start disobeying me, my blessings go away. Don't let them not be the thing that drives your life. And then he says, you shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house, and when you're walking by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens are above the earth. For if you will be careful to do all this commandment that I command you to do, loving the Lord your God, walking in all his ways, and holding fast to him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you. You will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your territory shall be from the wilderness to the Lebanon, and from the river Euphrates, to the western sea. No one shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will lay the fear of you and the dread of you on all the land that you shall tread, as he promised. There's no way to doubt what God is saying. God's saying you have two choices, plan A, plan B. Plan A is you obey me, you follow my commandments, and I will bless you. And you will have not just what you need, not just get by, but you will have an abundance. Plan B, you disobey me, and all that goes away. That's not hard to understand. He goes on to say, see, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. Plan A, plan B. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way that I am commanding you today. Go after other gods that you have not known. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not beyond the Jordan, west of the road going toward the going down of the sun, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arba, opposite Gilgal, besides the oak of Moreh? For you are to cross over the Jordan, to go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And when you possess it and live in it, you shall be careful not to do all the statutes and the rules that I am setting before you today. Pretty simple. But what did they do? Well, he said, first off, teach your children. Because one day they are going to be the ones who are responsible for carrying on what it is that I am telling you. Obey me, blessing. Disobey me, no blessing. Teach your children. Don't just do this as a casual thing. Teach your children when you're at home. Teach your children when you're out working. Teach your children when you're on the road. Teach your children the things that I am telling you. That is to be your priority where your children are concerned. You didn't rebel against me. I gave you a chance, but now you're responsible. Your parents are gone. It's time to grow up. It's time to take responsibility. It's time to be the people of God. And they did exactly what God wanted them not to do. They followed other gods. They made things a priority more than God. They didn't teach their children what they learned when their parents rebelled against God. They forgot to tell them the stories about Egypt and the Red Sea. The walls when Jericho fell. How the Jordan River parted at flood stage when they were crossing to come into the land. How God took out all these people in front of them, and then they actually sacrificed their children to false gods. And the real God who had given them a choice sent them warning after warning. There were droughts. There were famines. It didn't rain for 3 years. Invading armies came. The northern part of the nation was taken away into captivity and never returned. They still didn't heed God's warning. The southern part of the kingdom that God had given them was taken into captivity for 70 years. By the way, the exact number of Sabbaths that God told them to observe that they didn't observe. And then finally they were allowed to come back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem and reestablish themselves in the nation, which was an absolute miracle and never happened in history up to that point. And now it's happened to this nation 2 times. After they came back, they again began to ignore God. They didn't teach the consequences. They didn't keep His commandments. They were constantly under the control of another God. They were constantly being conquered by a new people. Sometimes they were slaughtered, and they continued to rebel against God. God's love for them is not conditional. God's salvation never has and never will be conditional. But God's blessing is conditional. And then God established a new nation where no nation had ever existed, on a continent that nobody knew about for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. And He based it on His law. It was blessed by His doing, and the conditions were the same. Follow me, and you will be blessed above all nations on earth. You will have not only what you need, but an abundance. But if you turn your back on me, and you worship other gods, my blessings will go away. And that's what the United States has done. This nation has been blessed by God more than any nation in the history of the world. The abundance that we have, nobody else even dreams of. I've been to several other countries now, kicking and screaming. I've tried to tell God I don't like to travel. He doesn't listen. But I have seen it with my own eyes. And the things that you have every day that you take for granted, other people in other parts of the world don't dream of. You can drink the water that comes out of your faucet. Do you understand what a big deal that is? Do you know that there are people in a lot of countries in the world that have to drink the water or die, but they die when they drink the water? Do you understand? I know you don't. If you have never been any place, do you understand what a wonderful thing it is to be able to drop your toilet paper in your toilet and flush it? That's a great thing. Do you understand not having to worry if you're going to have a meal today? Do you understand that there are a lot of people in a lot of places in the world that they don't have that? You are blessed to live in a place that has been greatly blessed by God. What you have is not just what you have to have. You have an abundance. Because this country was founded on the principles of God. And for a long time, this country has been governed by the principles of God. It's never been perfect, but the majority of the people in this country have always seen worshiping God and serving God and being obedient to God as something they need to do above and beyond all else, but that's going away. And if you don't think that we have false gods in this country, how much trust do you have more trust in God or your 401k? Do you have more trust in God or the military of the United States? Is God the predominant thing in your life, or is your security more in how much money you can make? And the security of our economy? And if you don't think we sacrifice our children to false gods, there were over 300,000 abortions performed in 2019. As we sacrifice our children to the god of sexual immorality. God's love is not conditional. God's salvation will never be conditional, but God's blessing is conditional, and we are teetering on the edge as a nation. Now, I don't know about you, but I can tell you that I was not taught the things of God. I was taught the opposite. But I've grown up. And I was not held responsible for the sins of those who didn't teach me. I suffered some of the consequences, but I wasn't held responsible. I don't have that privilege anymore. I'm old enough to know better. And now, it's my responsibility to teach those around me. It's your responsibility. It's our responsibility as the church of the living God to take the message of His salvation and proclaim it to the whole world, and especially to those who live across the street and down the road. I've had a couple of people since I've been here who have told me, well, you know, I guess it's all right for us to go over there and try to witness to them people overseas. We got plenty of people that are lost right here. And my answer to that is, how many have you talked to? Which usually ends the conversation. We're a country that has been blessed in abundance because our country has been based on the principles of God. And I don't think I have to tell you all the things, just turn the news on. We're not there anymore. We're very quickly turning more and more and more and more away from the things of God. God's love is not conditional. God's salvation never has been. But God's blessing is. Before they entered into the promised land, Joshua said, choose you this day who you will serve. And that choice is on your doorstep right now. So I ask you to examine yourself. How committed are you to God? How committed are you to learning about God? How committed are you to obeying God? How committed are you about teaching others about God? How committed are you to taking the gospel to the world around you? How many other things do you have that you've put above Him? How many things are above God on your priority list now? What's your faith with Him? Because it's you and not your parents, and not the ones who have come before us, and not the things that have happened before us that are responsible for the outcome of your future. Father, thank you for today and all the many blessings that you've given us.